And now we're going to be joined by Allan Nairn as a veteran investigative journalist who's currently there in Guatemala. Thanks so much for joining us, Allan, and taking the time for us. Now, former President Otto Perez Molina is currently facing these charges related to a fairly recent corruption incident that we've been hearing about plenty, La Linea as it's called. However, there have been many other allegations leveled against him that go back for decades. I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about those other allegations that we haven't heard so much about recently.
Yes, and just one note, the U.S. was urging Perez Molina not to resign. They were telling him not to resign. They said it would cause instability. They wanted to maintain the current order, but they weren't able to sustain that position because he was swept away by a democratic popular uprising. I met Perez Molina in the Ixil in the mountains in September of 1982 when he was implementing the Rios Montt program of slaughter against the Mayan population, the program that got Rios Montt convicted of genocide. I interviewed Perez Molina, who at that time was using the alias Major Tito, and I interviewed his troops as well as survivors of the massacres. And his troops described in detail how they would go into villages and slaughter civilians. They would make them dig their own mass graves. They would strangle them to death. They would come back and bomb them with U.S.-supplied helicopters. They would machine gun them from the air. All of this was under Perez Molina's command. And then later, I reported in the Nation magazine that when he was head of Rios, the military intelligence service in the 1990s, Perez Molina received funds from the CIA. Rios functioned for decades as essentially a torture and assassination service. And in that capacity, Perez Molina received the U.S. money, and the U.S. placed North American operatives working inside the Rios as they were carrying out these atrocities. At one point, the Rios even operated their own crematorium in the area of Huehuetenango, so they could dispose of the bodies of their victims. And the targets were really anyone who was seen as a critic of the army, a critic of the rich, anyone who didn't comply. In fact, in 1968, the U.S. military attaché defined the targets as guerrillas or potential guerrillas. And a potential guerrilla is anyone who one thinks could potentially in the future have prohibited thoughts. And it was also used to justify the killing of children. During these sweeps, there was mass killing of children. Pregnant women were split open. And the children were referred to as delincuentes subversivos, subversive delinquents.
You were saying there that the U.S. was encouraging Perez Molina not to resign. That's something I hadn't heard. I'm just wondering how we know that.
Well, I spoke to people who were involved in that. It was interesting, the U.S. position, because the U.S. is very close to CACIF, the Association of the Oligarchy, and they always worked together. In this case, they had a difference of opinion. CACIF felt Perez Molina had become too much of a burden. They wanted to ease him out. They felt he had lost control of the population. The U.S. felt it would be more destabilizing if he resigned. So they urged him to stay in. But of course, as the popular uprising just grew and grew, he had no choice. In fact, he was facing arrest this morning, and it was hours before that he resigned. And he has since been arrested, and he's now in prison.
All right, Mr. Allan Nairn, thanks so much for joining us to give us some insight on the situation there in Guatemala.